Hello and welcome to Moneylife. This is Sucheta Dalal. This is the latest edition of our vlog. So this time I'm going to continue on the theme that I mentioned last week, which is that when governments do not want feedback, what happens? They tend to make regulators and policymakers completely unaccountable to us, the people. So last week, I talked about how the government's refusal to listen to stakeholders often led to serious embarrassment to itself, not only in the country, but even internationally. So two developments this week hold out some hope that maybe the government has at last begun to listen to people instead of being guided by selective data and wrong advice by its bureaucrats. So the first is that it finally listened to all the appeals from chartered accountants and has extended the time for corporate tax filing. It's there in the papers, you can look at the link. Moneylife, in fact, had gone and published a detailed piece by Mr. Amit Patel, a chartered accountant, explaining the torture that was unleashed by the new faulty tax portal, as well as punitive regulations that have been unleashed on people in the last few years. Remember, Mr. Patel had talked about tax torture 1 during UPA 2, and it looks like we are back there and worse. So, signs that the government is finally listening. Second thing is that it has finally realized that in mobile telephony, you cannot have a duopoly of just two players, however powerful they may be. You cannot allow everybody else to sync. So it has taken the first concrete step towards giving what was previously Vodafone or VI at Tata Teleservices a fighting chance of survival by converting the dues that they owe to government into equity. This is important because several players who are dominant today have had the most shady entry into this business. But two examples don't give us cause to celebrate as yet. There are bigger issues that we need to look at. If anything, there is increasing evidence now that the National Democratic Alliance government, which projects itself as strong and action-oriented, has ended up giving unbridled power to bureaucrats and regulators without any oversight or accountability to them for their actions. Consequently, the government is seen as being reckless and uninformed. In fact, as lots of people say, people who are elected representatives have an examination and are evaluated every 5 years. Bureaucrats and regulators go on forever and do not ever have to pay for their mistakes. So I'm going to show this with 3 examples. The first is UPI frauds. Now, all of you know that Unified Payments Interface has been like a global phenomenon, a big success story. Indians have adopted it in a big way. There's been explosive growth. We have been seeing the other side of the story, which is the number of people complaining to Moneylife Foundation about being defrauded, how easy it is to use UPI to fool people, confidence tricksters it's called. Now, the Ken, which is a newsletter, wrote last week that UPI frauds are undermining India's payments fairy telling. What the article says is this, that payment companies have no institutional mechanism to help them go after fraudsters. In fact, I quote, it says, only banks are mandated to report frauds, not payment apps. There is no infrastructure through which they can share data on phone numbers tied to scams either. Nor is there a central pool of information. While companies inform NPCI, which is a National Payments Corporation of India, about new scams, they don't share data about scams with each other. End quote. The article goes on to say that victims first approach banks when they're defrauded, but banks are reluctant to pursue it any further. The article is all about how digital companies or fintech companies have been employing hundreds of people in order to try and fix things at their level to prevent their customers from being defrauded. Now, UPI frauds have been around for at least 4 to 5 years, and they've been perhaps growing at a tandem with the explosive growth of the use of UPI itself. So why don't we have a proper mechanism for reporting fraud and ensuring that people get their money back? Why is this left to the police, who we know are as digitally unsavvy as the rest of us and do not even have the infrastructure to deal with digital fraud? But that is where you're asked to go and complain, which really means that most people have to just kiss their money goodbye. So I asked this to a senior official who has long experience both with the technology space, regulation, and investigation. This is what he tells me. He says, like most other areas of innovation, risk management in India comes as an afterthought. The ability to raise a dispute should have been part of the platform itself. Card payment systems have already had such mechanisms for several years, but UPI's interface is, while exclusively electronic, could have easily built such a feature, but its system architects probably did not prioritize this. This is the story of India. In fact, NCPI, he says, could have set up an industry-level coordination mechanism. But remember, NCPI, while set up by the RBI, is a Section 25 or a not-for-profit company. So it's not a regulator. The buck for this, if anything, really stops at the Reserve Bank of India only. And NPCI is too busy worrying about the growth of the platform and celebrating it than bothering about frauds, because they are always seen as a smaller number, not worth worrying about. Now, when was the last time that the RBI has engaged with stakeholders? Government dismisses all criticism as negativity. Even worse, if you get cheated, you are blamed for being ignorant and not understanding, being naive. What also happens is biggest victims of UPI frauds are usually senior citizens or economically weak people. Who listens to them? So people get cheated, they probably stop using UPI, but because there are newer and newer people coming into it, we are celebrating. This is what happens with UPI. It's also true of Aadhaar. It's mandatory for a variety of statutory transactions and interactions with the government. The redress mechanism, even updation, is so poor that UIDAI, while boasting of its efficiency, for every change, every upload, it gives itself 90 days for doing it, which means it can happen instantly, or if it doesn't, you have to wait. Now, you may need some change urgently. You may need it for a bank account, you may need it for some other identity proof. If it takes time, it takes time. If it is rejected, there are very few ways to set things right. This is also true of the still glitchy MCA 21. MCA 21 is a statutory reporting portal of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. MCA 21 as well as the new tax portal have both been set up by Infosys. And the problem with both these portals has been dragging on and on for over a year. In fact, here's what a company secretary tells me. He says the portal has a ticket system to flag problems, but we get idiotic responses when we lodge complaints, and writing to senior bureaucrats gets no response at all. Come back to the same theme, the unwillingness to listen to feedback, being seen as complainers, okay? It actually allows bureaucrats and policymakers, as well as regulators, to misguide government by giving them selective data and information to show that they're very efficient, which is then tom-tommed, and they in fact unleash reckless action or ill-conceived policies that create the image of a ruthless and unthinking government. Consider how dangerous this is. Two more examples will illustrate this. You remember the collapse of Yes Bank and how it was bailed out by a public-private partnership between State Bank of India and a bunch of private banks? That happened in March 2020. Story is that RBI should have acted much faster on Yes Bank. It didn't. Finally, when there was hell to pay, there was a moratorium. Private banks also came to the rescue. One big problem was there was a lot of interest in Yes Bank. It was a large private bank. Many global funds wanted to join the rescue. RBI stubbornly said no. They said, when you raise funds again, you may bring in foreign investors. So it was only Indian banks. Fine. What they also did is that they just canceled AT1 bonds, which is additional tier 1 bonds. These are special bonds which help capitalize the bank. 8,400 crore worth of these bonds were just abolished overnight, and thousands of hapless people, mainly senior citizens and investors to mutual funds, were left with a big hole in their lifetime savings. In fact, on 19th March 2020, I'd written, the decision to write down the bonds was not even in the Gazette notification of 13th March. I'd put in an image, you can see it, nor was it part of RBI's reconstruction announcement. In fact, almost overnight, things had changed and the bonds were just cancelled. Last week, the Mint newspaper added another twist to this dubious saga. So the Mint says that in a response to a right to information filing, the Finance Ministry has indicated that RBI, as we all know, was not originally in favor of writing off the bonds. In fact, it had taken all the steps required to convert them into equity at a written down price, which is what everybody in the banking system recommended, pleaded, and advised the RBI to do. And there was shock when these bonds were cancelled. There's been a disastrous impact on the issue of further 81 bonds, but it happened and nobody knew why, because the RBI keeps quiet. So now the Mint article really ends up giving an explanation for what I wrote in March 2020. So it turns out that the Department of Financial Supervision officials had overruled the banking regulator. Were they aware of the ground reality of how 81 bonds were sold? They were hard sold to senior citizens by the bank itself and its relationship managers as being safer than fixed deposits. Mutual funds also had bought them because they were considered safe. Nobody knew that the bank would be closed down overnight, would need to be rescued, or the rescue would be so lopsided. So did the government and the bureaucrat over there who overruled the banking regulator, mind you, understand the implications of his or her action? Since the RBI doesn't seem to have had the courage to stand its ground, the faceless bureaucrat has got away without any consequences. He or she is not even known. In fact, this person may be rewarded with a powerful post-retirement regulatory posting and wreak similar havoc all over again because nobody is asking questions. What is worse, the RBI, knowing full well what has been done to the savings of innocent retail investors, is actually taking an anti-depositor stand in court and refusing to admit that mis-selling happened in spite of evidence. Evidence in emails which we have published. We published this on 12th March. Those of you who want can go and look at the Moneylife website for these articles. Securities and Exchange Board of India has taken a diametrically opposite stand to the RBI, making a mockery of the whole process of having Finance Ministry and RBI officials on SEBI boards, having these joint meetings. Apparently, they don't even talk to each other, don't discuss, don't look at how their actions affect us, savers and investors. Now, my last example, which is the change in guard at RBL Bank. Remember, I've done a blog just a couple of weeks ago about the big upheaval on Christmas weekend when the RBL suddenly announced that at the nudge of the Reserve Bank of India, its managing director and CEO, Vishwavir Ahuja, was leaving that very day and had to hand over charge to the executive director. It's panic in the market. There was a con call in the evening. There was a run on the bank the next morning. And the whole Christmas weekend was complete chaos. If you were a depositor, you wouldn't know what to do next and whether in the morning before banking hours, the RBI was going to announce that you could not withdraw money. Fortunately, as things turn out, with a lot of nudging and after the con call, the RBI issued a press release in the morning, rare press statement, which calmed things down and actually said that there was nothing to worry about. So I asked then, and I'm asking again, why was Mr. Ahuja's term cut short? Why did the Reserve Bank of India create such panic with a manufactured drama? Had there been a run on bank deposits because people never trust the RBI to act in time, who would be responsible? On further checking, I learned from my sources with the bank as well as RBI that it was an ego clash between the former MD and a RBI deputy governor. It is amazing that the RBI and its senior official face no consequences for triggering the panic. They are supposed to ensure a smooth transition. They're supposed to ensure that banks remain safe. And here's a bank where there was no problem, And panic was manufactured by an RBI action with no consequences. Remember, that is the important part. So my three examples show you what happens when the buck stops at the government. Because remember, the finance ministry is in charge and the government has to take responsibility. If it does not listen, it does not question policymakers and regulators, and every time it listens to feedback, which it does not like, it is hostile to criticism, then it ends up destroying accountability. It breeds arrogance and disdain for shareholders, stakeholders, which is we, the people, among bureaucrats. This hurts the government more than it hurts the bureaucrat, whether it is UPA 2 or, as everybody is saying, NDA 2, which is looking more and more like UPA 2. If you agree, share this vlog. Let's try and do something to make our policymakers accountable and get our government to listen. Thank you.